Hi, this is Andy. One of my least favorite phrases over the last couple of years is the term social distancing. I mean, I understand the idea and I work to be diligent about keeping others safe, but that's physical distancing and that had its place. Social distancing, on the other hand, has been arguably devastating. My guest today says that without even realizing it, we are subtly turning our backs on humanity every day. Stephen Van Cohen joins us today to talk about his new book entitled Connectable: How Leaders Can Move Teams from Isolated to All In. It's a book about the crisis of loneliness. And in today's discussion, Stephen will talk about the difference between loneliness and solitude. I'm going to say that one again. It's a book about the crisis of loneliness. And in today's discussion, Stephen will talk about the difference between loneliness and solitude. He'll talk about some of the biggest contributors to modern day loneliness and how we as leaders can strive to foster more belonging on our teams. Steve will give us an introduction to his less lonely framework, including ways to help us more easily spot lonely workers and invest in connection. It's a conversation I've been looking forward to sharing with you about a book that I consider a must read. Well, quick note, if you haven't already, I'd love to have you join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to leveling up our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week. And it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Stephen about his book, Connectable. Steve, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
It's my pleasure, Andy. How are you?
Oh, just great. I've really been looking forward to this. Before we get into the book, I'd love for our listeners to learn more about you and your co-author, Ryan. So since he's not here, you can say anything you want, right? So
yes.
In what ways are you and Ryan similar, and for that matter, maybe different in your styles and approaches? And how did those similarities and differences impact the co-authoring of a book like this?
Yeah, so we're different in a very major way. I am full-blown extrovert. He's full-blown introvert. So when we started to dive into this topic of loneliness, we had very, very different perspectives. As someone who is very comfortable reaching out and communicating with anybody around me, and with Ryan being a bit hesitant to, go ahead and talk to the strangers around him, we had lots to unpack from both of our perspectives. So that was a major difference. The similarity is, Ryan and I both are very research focused, and we spent 2 years doing a deep dive into all of the research we could unpack as it relates to this topic. And we both wanted to find ways to make this as easy to read and as fun. I mean, when you think about talking about loneliness, you don't think about it being fun and enjoyable. It's still a topic that is shrouded in shame and it's stigmatized. So we wanted to make it as accessible as we could. So we shared a lot of those same similarities and perspectives. So when we started to write, it all came together really nicely.
It did not feel disjointed at all. I feel like you guys really navigated the who's talking if it was necessary, but it was really a common voice. I thought it was very easy to read. You're both great storytellers. So
well, thank you.
Yeah, you make a clear and I think compelling case in the book that there's a loneliness epidemic that's taking a toll on people and organizations. And you draw a clear distinction in the book between loneliness and solitude. So would you tell us about the difference?
Yeah. Solitude is actually insurance against loneliness, because when we think about loneliness, we have to start with the definition. Loneliness is not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection. I can still be surrounded by lots of people in an office and feel debilitatingly lonely, or I can be a remote worker who's home by myself all day long and feel fully connected. It's all about the connection. And when we start to unpack what allows us to feel connected, it's not just with other people, it's with ourselves, it's with the work we do, it's with our community, it's with our loved ones. There's all these connection points. And the reason that solitude is insurance against loneliness is because it gives us time to be with ourselves. It gives us time to reflect and understand how we're doing, how we're feeling, how we're, navigating the trials and tribulations of our day. And in a world that is busier than ever, with our attention being pulled in so many different ways, we need time to connect with ourselves, or else it's hard for us to be present with others.
Yeah. So it's not just as simple as isolation, right? Because you could be isolated and lonely, but you could be isolated, and this is the recovery solitude that I need, right? So
Yeah, isolation itself is neither positive or negative, right? It's all about how you are feeling in that moment and how you're using that time when you get it.
yeah.
So, Ryan, as the introvert, he talks a lot about how important his solitude is. He,
Mhm.
has 3 kids under 6, and his household is very, very busy, and he is surrounded by lots of people who love him very much. But he needs that time to connect with himself, or else he's just serving everyone around him. And if you're only serving everyone around you, it's like the oxygen mask on the airplane, right?
Right.
Like you need to get your own air, or else you're not going to be able to show up. So, yeah, there is some interesting research, and we unpack quite a bit about that research in the book
Oh, yeah.
as it pertains to our need for time alone.
Yeah. I actually expected more influence of extroversion and introversion than what you actually found in the data on this one. Because as somebody, just like you and Ryan, I spend a lot of time customer focused on stages with lots of people. But that doesn't mean, in my case, I'm not extroverted. So what I do, if it's like an all-day workshop over lunch, I'll just go off by myself. That's my solitude to recharge. But you could, it seems like I expected, well, extroverts are going to be less lonely, but
Yeah,
that wasn't the case at all in your data, right?
no. Well, it's really interesting is loneliness is one of those things that is very individualistic. So it's the perceived inadequacy associated with the connections in your life. So
Mhm.
the term perceived inadequacy means you and how many people you interact with, and the quality of those interactions is very different for
Mhm.
your quota
Mhm.
than mine, than the other people around you. It's all about how we feel about our connections,
Yeah.
which makes loneliness a bit of a tricky emotion to navigate, because there isn't a one size fits all. Well, yeah, just go talk to 2 more people a day, or spend
Mhm.
45 minutes doing this, and you can eradicate loneliness altogether. That's not the case.
Yeah.
It is very, very specific to each and every person.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Certainly loneliness isn't something new, right? It's been experienced for centuries. But what are some of the big, let's say, contributors to modern day loneliness?
There are 3. There are a lot, but for our time together, Andy, I'll go through 3.
Mhm.
The first one is what we call dependency shift.
Mhm.
And 20 years ago, if I wanted to take a date out, I would call a friend to figure out what restaurant to go to. If something broke in my house, I would go find a neighbor to ask for help. If I needed advice, I'd call my mom or dad. Now, if I need to figure out where to take a date, I go to Yelp. If I need advice on how to fix something, I go to YouTube. If I need advice, I go to Google.
Yeah.
The amount of time that we need to lean on each other
Mhm.
is essentially been eradicated by the internet. So while we still have access to brilliant minds and people with lots of wisdom and stories and experiences, we default to what's easy, which is to essentially problem solve ourselves. And that multiplied across all of the queries that we have in any given day means we're just not leaning on each other as much as we once did. And that's creating a big gap. So that's one, is dependency shift. The second is what we call trading connection for convenience.
Mhm.
And it's similar to the dependency shift, but it's different in the sense that the amount of just human to human shoulder rubbing
Yeah.
that we used to do no longer is needed, right? So if I go to Starbucks, I don't even need to wait in line. I just order it online and I walk in, I grab my coffee, no human necessary. I'm able to just get in and out without any kind of interaction. And that wasn't the case not that long ago,
Right.
right?
Right.
I grew up in the 90s. If I wanted a piece of music, I would have to take my bike to Tower Records. I would then interact with somebody behind the CD stand to, play the song in my headphones. I would interact with somebody in line. I would interact with a cashier, and then I'd have to go to a friend's house to listen to that together, because I'd be the only one with that piece of music.
Mhm.
So we're just not having as much exposure. And then the third is busyness.
Yeah.
There's just not a lot of margin for us to have that time, the meaningful time with one another. And there's a big difference between communication and connection. We're communicating all day, every day, but the part of our brain that registers communication is different from the part of the brain that registers connection. And unless we're finding ways to be intentional about connecting, we're essentially not getting those connection touch points that we need in order to feel fully seen. So those are three really big ones. There are 10 that we unpack in the book, but I think all of your listeners can understand that, those are impacting me on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, for sure. One that resonated with me in addition to those, because I think those are maybe three of the biggest, was the overly professional one that you mentioned about leaving the humanity at the door. And whether we want to blame it on cancel culture or political correctness, I think sometimes people are like, I don't want to speak up, or we have to be fair to everybody. It's almost like we don't want to treat people like resources, but we end up having to treat them like resources so we don't offend somebody, and part of being connected is getting to know each other. And right. So I don't know if that's exactly what you meant by overly professional, but that's kind of how I took it.
Yeah. Well, we do a good job of creating an avatar that allows us to be the person we feel like we need to be at work. Yeah. And as long as we're showing up, pretending to be somebody that we think we need to be, we're not allowing ourselves to really connect with the people around us, because it's hard to build trust. It's hard to connect. It's hard to empathize. It's hard to understand somebody that isn't being truly genuine. And this doesn't mean you need to show up and open the closet and sort of like air out all of the things that are going on in your life that might make you extra vulnerable, but it is about being a bit human. It's interesting. One of my clients, I do a lot of coaching and leadership development work. And I have a client, she's a project engineer for a really large company. And she contacted me and she said, I got some devastating news from my boss. My boss told me that the people that I'm interacting with told me that I'm very difficult and that I'm hard to get along with. And she said, she goes, I'm losing sleep over it. I've never once in my career ever had any kind of feedback like that before. So we started to unpack what's going on and try to figure out and pinpoint what's happening. And she said something interesting. She said, Steve, at my last job, my nickname was Smiley. I'm like, well, going from Smiley to being difficult to deal with, that's quite
a jump.
quite a jump. And she said, the difference is I worked really closely with the people on my teams and I knew them really well over an extended period of time. She goes, now I jump from project to project to project. None of the cameras are ever on, and I'm only having very tactical conversations. And it's preventing her from actually being like herself, and people don't understand her. And there's not that time for rapport because everything's on a 5-minute deadline. So, and you're right, unless we're taking time to see the person and not the professional, we're going to have these disconnected experiences that make people feel totally misunderstood, which is, very, very lonely.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that it's not necessarily our job as leaders to ensure that people have friends. In fact, I think that section was, I live in Chicago, and I think is when you moved from Chicago area to Nevada, I think, and you experienced some loneliness, and you say, well, it wasn't necessarily their job to make sure you had friends, but we can try as leaders to set conditions for what you refer to as belonging, let's say. So how do you explain what belonging is and what it isn't? Because I think it's an easy word to, in fact, with diversity and equity and a lot of these words, it's easy to not really catch what you mean.
In its simplest form, loneliness is the experience of being seen through. Belonging is the experience of being seen as, meaning that the person I'm talking to, they care about me, and they're really listening to me. They're able to empathize with me. They're able to understand me. They show interest in me. They're able to give me some kind of positive affirmation or value, make me feel contributory to the group. It's all about feeling seen. You talk about my experience moving from Chicago. I actually grew up in Arlington Heights. So
I'm in Lake Zurich. So right.
You're in Lake Zurich, so not too far.
Right.
And when I moved to Elko, Nevada, which is population 30,000, really small little town, I moved for my first consulting project, and I did not have any concern whatsoever around being lonely. I'm an extrovert. I make friends really easy. I have a huge community of people in my life. And I thought, you know what? This is a fun new challenge. And it's going to be great. It took 4 months, 4 months for me to feel like I've never felt before in my life. And even though I had lots of colleagues and I was interacting with, a few hundred people at work because I was a consultant doing different types of projects, no one cared about me. No one was really interested in me. And I'm not a hunter. I don't fish. I don't RV. I don't really camp. I'm from the city. So these people that I was interacting with, we just didn't have a lot of natural commonalities. And I felt totally lost. And it was awful. I mean, so much so that, 4 months in, it was really hard for me to even get off my couch on the weekend just because I didn't feel like, what's the point? No one's interested. So while it wasn't my boss's responsibility to create friendships for me, to your point, Andy, he should have been able to recognize, hey, this is a person who moved from Chicago, Illinois to a small little town. This is a person who's never worked in this industry before. This is a 24-year-old who doesn't have kids. He's single, and he probably needs some help forging some kind of connections. And it's up to our leaders to create an environment while we're at work to help us feel as, included and important and significant as they can. And we don't expect leaders to be therapists. We don't expect you to be psychologists. But when someone's on your bus at work, you do have a responsibility to make sure that they are in the best position to possibly succeed and be seen.
Yeah. And you could have faked it to be a hunter or an RVer, but you had a Brene Brown quote, and if I remember right, it was something along the lines of fitting in and belonging are not the same thing. Would you mind describing those?
Well, essentially, it's this idea that the only way to really belong is to be yourself and be accepted. As long as I'm putting on, we called it the avatar, as long as I'm pretending to be somebody I'm not really being in a state of belonging. I'm being maybe accepted or maybe adopted into this group. But unless people really understand and are interested in me as the person, my true person, then I'm still going to feel disconnected and disjointed. And it's not going to achieve the end goal. So while I'm not into hunting and fishing, there are lots of other things that I'm sure we could have found some common ground and commonality in. But it was just this sensation of not feeling like anyone really cared. Right. And if they don't care, then why would I care? And it creates this, awful cycle that is really hard to get out of.
Yeah. There's a line that you had in the book that I just haven't been able to shake. It said something along the lines of, the bandit of belonging isn't difference, but distance. So would you, because in some ways you were close to some other people, you were different, you were close to them, but there was distance there. What do you mean by that?
Well, they did. So Mina Sakara, she's a researcher, and she looked at Boston Red Sox fans and Yankees fans, and very, very heated rivalry. Andy, we're both from Chicago. So if we talk about Chicago Cubs fans and White Sox fans, again, another rivalry.
Bears,
Packers. But what she did, or Bears and Packers. Oh yeah. I've got the EBGBs just thinking about Packers fans, even though I married one. That's a story for another time. But what she did is she forced the people in her study who are Yankees fans and Red Sox fans to do a mental exercise where they thought about growing up in a borough in New York, or they thought about growing up in, a part of Boston and what that must have been like, and the nostalgia associated with that city and the traditions that they had there, and what you would have felt growing up in that space. And when we can put ourselves in other people's shoes, that distance is lessened. And Abraham Lincoln's got this great line. He essentially says, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better. Awesome. And that is the bandit of belonging. When we can take time to find some common ground, when we can take time to better understand the people around us, even though we're not going to be the same, it can shorten that distance quite a bit. And there was a great 60 Minutes episode that aired like a month and a half ago. And they pulled people from two different ends of the political spectrum. So they had a conservative on one side and they had a liberal on the other. And they wanted to have a dialogue that was a productive dialogue. And the way that they each started is the one person read the other person's bio, and they were forced to find commonalities that they shared that weren't political in nature, and to watch them interact after they've done that exercise and they can build some rapport and some understanding. The conversations are so amazing because it's no longer you're wrong and I'm right. And it's not a banter. It's, well, let's actually explore this. We have some things in common. Why are you like that? And why am I like this? And it's just a totally different dynamic when we can start to find a bit of common ground with one another. And at work, we don't do that enough because, we're jumping from meeting to meeting to meeting, and we're so busy and there's deadlines everywhere, and it creates so much distance that prevents belonging from taking place.
I think it's just a good reminder, that Abraham Lincoln quote, because I think our natural thing is, I don't like that person, I'm going to unfriend them. And at work, you can't unfriend a stakeholder, but you can still choose to spend less time with them, where really this is a call for, wow, I'm probably caricaturing that person, right? Yeah, I'm probably caricaturing. So maybe, what if I spend some more time? We're not going to talk about the project. We're not going to talk about our differences of opinion, but just try to get to know each other a little bit more. I think the line in the book was something like, understanding and empathy grow with proximity. Yeah,
100%.
yeah.
And what's interesting is it doesn't take a full offsite, or like a full day offsite, or it doesn't take some really massive overhaul in, how we're interacting with each other. They're called pro-social behaviors. So pro-social behaviors are behaviors that allow two people to connect really quickly. And pro-social behaviors are things like showing empathy, asking genuine questions, really listening to what the person has to say, asking questions that allow the person to, feel like they're in the spotlight.
Mhm.
And at work, we can do these pro-social behaviors, and we could build in some time to create this that doesn't take a lot of effort. My favorite activity is an activity that's called show and tell.
Mhm.
And show and tell channels our inner 6-year-olds. And what happens is, every Monday morning, if you have a team and you get together at that point in time to do a weekly kickoff, you just choose one person each week, and that person shows one item that is important to them, and they take 30 seconds to explain why this item has significant meaning. And just that alone allows all of the other people to see the person and not the professional. And it doesn't take a lot of time. It's not like a huge commitment. It's not hard to do. It's not stressful. It's pretty easy for each person to just find something and talk about it for a few seconds. But it's those little things that we don't do naturally that we have to be intentional about if we want to get past professional. And it's something that I work a lot with my clients. And the impact is immediate. It's unbelievable how quickly people can start to see a different side of each other, and how impactful that is.
You have some great stories of awareness that people had, because and it works virtually, right? I mean, you don't have to be co-located. So some things are more difficult to do virtually, but that one could easily work virtually.
Yeah, I had a client, he works for the largest chemical manufacturing company in the world, huge company. And he showed his hiking boots. And it just turns out that somebody on his immediate team who he's worked with for years is also a mountain climber. And they had no idea. And it
Right.
created a whole nother level of rapport and friendship. And they started to talk about this and got closer. And it took 45 seconds for him to just talk about his interest in mountain climbing, that now they have more trust and more understanding, and a bit more interest in talking to each other. And that's invaluable.
And it took a minute, right? So,
and it took a minute. Exactly.
Yeah. Listeners will need to get a copy of your book to get the full benefit of understanding your less lonely framework, which I love even the name of it. Just, we're not trying to eradicate loneliness. It's just less lonely framework. But let's zero in on a couple of the steps. You say that less loneliness starts with a look. And as a way of explaining what that means, can you think of an example of how that was done to you ever? Can you think of an example of that?
Yeah. So look at loneliness has 3 parts. The first is looking at the topic and just understanding why it's so important to address. So anybody who's listening to this episode, check that box. Congratulations. You've gotten the first part done. And then the second is to look at loneliness in yourself. And it's a matter of just taking a moment to kind of do a pulse check on how lonely am I feeling, or how have I gone through and navigated loneliness for myself? Because when we can connect with it ourselves, then it allows us to empathize and, be a bit more perceptive to others. And then the third, and this is where most of, my clients navigate the most, is it's looking at loneliness in others. And the idea is to take a page from Ansel Adams, the famed photographer. And Ansel says, photos are usually looked at, seldom looked into. And as a leader, That is so true. There's all these people and I see them and I kind of know what they're doing, but until I really start to look past the surface level things that are very obvious and start to look into what's going on with a bit more depth, it's really hard for me to spot signs of loneliness. So that's what look is all about.
Yeah.
And you talk about, we were catching up before
Yeah.
this episode, and there's a story by a guy named Kevin Hines. And Kevin Hines, he epitomizes the absolute importance of looking at the people around you. And the Cliff Note version of the story is Kevin was riding on a bus to the Golden Gate Bridge to end his life. And as a last ditch effort to hopefully be seen and to derail this idea of jumping off the bridge, he looked at the bus driver with panic on his face. And the bus driver said, "Kid, what are you doing? Get off the bus." And his last ditch effort, he turned to the person standing behind him, hoping maybe he would see the panic and despair and just, what he was going through in his eyes. And the guy behind him said, "Kid, what the hell is wrong with you? Get off the bus." And that was it. That was the final, motivation that he needed to run off the bus. He jumped over the bridge. He crashed into the water and he sunk. And right before he hit the bottom, because he broke his back, he broke his legs, he had all these terrible injuries, something started to swim underneath him. And this creature that was swimming underneath him gave him enough lift to be able to stay afloat and be seen by the Coast Guard that ended up pulling him out of the water and saving his life. And that creature was a seal. And the seal, for whatever reason, noticed this and was able to get him to the surface. And Kevin shares his story as a motivational speaker. And he says, if one person would have just asked how I was doing, that's all I needed to have been able to derail this suicide attempt. And yet we don't do that enough. We're just too nose down in whatever we're doing, that we're not paying attention to the people around us. And looking is a commitment to our team, our family, our friends, our community, humanity in general, to say, I'm here for you and I'm interested, right? Because one look is really powerful. So that's what that whole part of the model is all about.
And like you said before, you don't have to be a therapist, right? But part of it is just slowing down enough. There was a quote at the beginning of one of the chapters, and I'll butcher it, but it's something along the lines of, try to look at everything either like it was the first time you saw it or the last time you're going to see it, and you'll have endless joy. The source of the quote said it much more eloquently than that, but I think there's something about, who it's easy, I think sometimes, Steve, to not look at is the person who's awesome all the time. They're delivering all the time. They're excellent. And we kind of moderate to expect that. And we stop expressing gratitude, and they can start feeling unappreciated, not looked at. Why am I going through all these motions, right? We don't really, I think the way you said, or maybe Ansel Adams was as well, we don't really look at our team. We don't look through the performance. I don't know, any thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where we have to take time to understand. And if we don't, then there are all these subtly elusive signs that people are demonstrating that might cause them to leave, right? They're giving you a cue to lean in, to ask them how they're doing, to maybe give them the necessary attention that they're requiring in that moment. And if we're not mindful of those cues, we're going to lose good talent. We're going to demotivate people who are top performers. We're going to alienate those who need us most in those moments. And it's one of those things where it's so tricky to pay attention to unless we're aware of it. And that's what looking is all about. It's about that awareness and then the commitment to be vigilant to actually do it.
Yeah. So let's actually build on that, because I think we are blind to it maybe more than what we realize. So you share some examples in the book of how do you spot lonely workers? What are a couple examples that come to mind?
The three that always catch people off guard is, one is a lack of learning and development. And that just means that someone on your team is not pushing their limits. They're not trying to grow. They're not taking on new challenges. They've almost become complacent. The second is excessive work. If someone's working a lot more than others, or if they're working a lot more than they usually do, oftentimes it's a sign that they're masking the inadequacies in their personal life. So if someone's working really hard, while you don't want to derail them from putting in a lot of good effort, you do want to make sure that they're not overworking because they're avoiding some of the realities in their personal life. So that's an important one, is excessive work. And then the next one is essentially just a shift in routine. So Somebody used to be happy and joyful and they're not. That's a pretty obvious one. But
Yeah.
if people start showing up late to meetings, if they start going to meetings without their camera on, any kind of a break in routine can give you a clue that something's going on. And maybe it's loneliness. And, we didn't talk about this at the beginning of the conversation, but our research shows that 72% of global workers feel lonely monthly and 55% say they feel lonely weekly. So you got to assume that somebody on your team is feeling this way. And unless you're mindful of paying attention to some of these signs, you're not going to be aware of it.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that your point in that section also about they only talk about work. Like they never talk about other things. It's not like we have to pry into them or whatever, but I think there's probably more, like you're saying, like these little signs. If we pay attention to them, we can pick up on them. And so that's the kind of the look part of it. I remember the I, because it's link, LI is more like invest in connection. And you mentioned, it's a term that I thought was just kind of interesting. We should serve as leaders as normalizers in chief when it comes to mental health challenges like loneliness. So what are some ways you've seen that done well? And then any other of your favorite ways of investing in connection?
Yeah. So the best way is to focus on relatability over vulnerability.
Mhm.
There is a lot of emphasis on vulnerability that's made famous by Brene Brown and all of her amazing work. But we've learned that when it comes to leadership, you don't have to necessarily be vulnerable, but you do have to be relatable.
Yeah.
And people do need to understand like what's going on with you. And if you're having an off day, explaining what's going on with whatever you're comfortable sharing. And the more relatable we can be, the more likely that people are going to be able to gravitate towards us and understand us and trust us. And there's a lot of really powerful benefits that come with that. But my favorite strategy when it comes to investing in connections is this idea of listening to unlock. Now, usually when we listen to win, which means we're paying attention enough so we can get our point across in the way that we want it to get somebody to do what we want them to do. Or we listen to fix. So we're just listening so we know how to give somebody the advice that maybe they need. But rarely do we listen to unlock, which is listening just out of genuine curiosity, where we're listening to understand a perspective or a feeling or an emotion or whatever that person's going through. And when we invest in connections, that listening to unlock piece is essentially like the 300-foot macro must do for all of us if we want to show up for the people around us. And people know when you really are listening to them versus when you're just hearing them. And it's one of those key things that we take for granted in the interactions we have with others that are really important when we think about how we interact at work.
I'm so glad you brought that up because the vulnerability and the relatability part, because I feel like a lot of books on this topic are like, be your authentic self. And,
Yeah.
you said it before. I don't remember exactly how I said it, but it's like, open the closet, right? Like open up everything. And after a while, it's like when someone starts a presentation, they go like, I'm really nervous, right? They're authentically explaining
Yeah.
how they feel, but that's not going to help them or their audience. It could erode trust. So this relatability, I think that section of the book, I think is particularly helpful to people. And another thing that this cracked me up, a lot of times when it comes to connections, we go, let's have a team outing, let's go to
No.
a ball game, let's go whatever. And it's not like you're like, those are a waste of time, but why is it that that doesn't necessarily end up being effective when it comes to connectability?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you a quick quote just to cement the importance of relatability.
Yeah.
It comes from Adam Grant, and he says, don't be the most authentic version of yourself, be the best version of yourself.
That's good.
Right? Like you have warts. Let's not show all the warts, but you can understand how to show off the best version because that does reveal authenticity, but it doesn't make you, totally inept when it comes to some of the things that maybe you need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
All right. But back to your question, the reason that a lot of the offsite team building events don't work, there's three big reasons. One is it's oftentimes after work hours. So I'm already tired. I've already put in a long day. I have commitments with friends, family, kids, etc. And if you're asking me to do something above and beyond, already that's annoying.
Yeah.
The second is most people talk about what they have in common. And what do people who work together have in common? Work. So we usually just talk about work. doesn't allow us to really see that other person or connect on a different wavelength. And then the third is most of the time when you have team offsites, the people who already like each other and know each other tend to hang out.
Mhm.
So unless you are really mindful of how to create an experience that is during working hours, that allows different people who aren't interacting to interact, and you've given them some kind of structure or some kind of parameters that allow them to open up in an easy way, oftentimes just throwing people at an event, it can do more harm than good. So we have to be really mindful of how to do that. And you're right, there's a good section in the book where we break down some ways to do that successfully.
Yeah, get the book to hear about speed dating and other ideas. That's actually, I thought they were really good. So many other ideas I'd love to talk with you about, Steve, but I'll end with this. You mentioned near the end of the book that when you're asked, what's the one thing we can do to lessen loneliness? Your answer is be interruptable, which I thought was really memorable. So here's kind of an odd way of asking the question. How does that influence how you parent? And what else comes to mind that you and your wife do to lessen loneliness at home for each other and for your kids?
Yeah. That's chapter 10. It's my favorite chapter. And I have a 4-year-old. I work from home. And for anybody who works from home who has a 4-year-old, there's lots of interruptions, lots of interruptions. And my 4-year-old particularly likes to interrupt me to have impromptu dance offs. And she'll say, Dad, please, can you just play Taylor Swift, or can you play Sing 2 or whatever the soundtrack is that she's obsessed with? And she just wants to have a dance party in my office. And what I've learned as I think about this, because I run a business, I have clients, I have deadlines, and I am someone who likes to be very productive. I've given myself some permission to be less productive and more remembered, because every time I acknowledge my daughter and that dance party, it's not only creating a beautiful memory for me, but it's allowing my daughter to understand that she's more important than whatever I'm doing on my computer. And while I cannot allow every dance party to happen all day, every day, I'm really mindful of using those interruptions to reinforce that she's important and that I see her and that I love her and that she's an important part of my life. So that is one of the ways that I have been able to navigate that for myself. And then my wife, her name is Jen, and Jen and I really resonated with some research from Dr. John Gottman. And Dr. John Gottman, he's an expert researcher on married couples. And he found that couples who got divorced in this 7-year time span only turned toward each other's bids, meaning I ask for your attention. Well, when I do that, that's called a bid. And couples who got divorced in less than 7 years only turned towards those bids and accepted them 30% of the time. The people who ended up staying married after the 7-year period, they turned towards each other's bids 90% of the time, meaning that if I interrupt my wife, she's on the phone, or if she's watching TV and I want to tell her something, she pauses it. She gives me her undivided attention, and she's acknowledging my bid and my need for her in that moment. And I do the same. And we're really mindful of turning towards each other when we are giving those bids and receiving those bids. So those are 2 ways that I'm being as interruptible as I can be in my personal life.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, for those listening, I can't tell you how much I personally benefited from Steve's book. I consider his book, Connectable, a must read. Get a copy and start putting these ideas in action for yourself and for those around you. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
My pleasure, Andy.